From Washington to Warsaw, Paris to Ankara, Brussels, Berlin, Bucharest, and Belgrade. Through pandemics and political movements, cooperation and confrontation, digital divides, and defending democracy. The German Marshall Fund is at the pulse of transatlantic relations today, convening the experts and insights needed to navigate tomorrow's world.
Hello, good morning and good afternoon to all of you that have logged on for today's program. My name is Sudha David-Wilp, and on behalf of the German Marshall Fund, I'd like to thank you for joining us today on a very timely discussion regarding economic resilience during the pandemic. We have two wonderful speakers, two expert speakers for our panel today. Before I introduce them, I'd like to thank our Business Alliance for making this discussion possible today, and to also encourage all of you to pose questions during the discussion. We'll get to that in about 25 minutes. You can use the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen, and the questions will automatically queue up, and I will get to them very shortly. But first, let's get to some introductions. I'm very pleased to welcome Jason Furman. He's here with us today from Cambridge. He's the Aetna Professor of the Practice of Economic Policy at the Harvard Kennedy School and also at the Department of Economics at Harvard University. He played a major role in all things economic during the Obama administration, and from 2013 to 2017, he was chairman of the Council of Economic Advisors, acting as both President Obama's chief economist and a member of the cabinet. He also holds a PhD from Harvard University. Welcome, Jason. I also am pleased to introduce my new colleague, Jakob Kirkegaard. He recently joined GMF last fall as a fellow, and he's based in our Brussels office. He's also still a senior fellow at the Peterson Institute for International Economics in Washington, D.C., and he has been working there since 2002. He's also worked previously with the Danish Ministry of Defense and with the UN in Iraq, and has also worked in finance in the private sector. His research focuses mainly on European economies and structure and institutional reform. He also touches on the subjects of climate change and US-EU economic competition. He holds a PhD from Johns Hopkins University. Good to see you, Jakob. Thank you. I guess I'll start with Jason first because, President Biden is running sort of a victory lap right now. He achieved his goal of passing economic relief legislation this month. And he said recently that the American Rescue Plan is already doing what it was designed to do, to make a difference in people's everyday lives. So Jason, from your point of view, how would you, is that statement accurate? What are the main tools of this $1.9 trillion relief package, and how will it change people's everyday lives?
Great. Thank you for including me in this discussion with my good friend Jakob. Something very unusual happened. In a lot of European countries, you're used to the government proposing something and the legislature passing it. That doesn't usually happen in the United States. We often say the president proposes and the Congress disposes. In this case, the Congress quite remarkably passed something very, very close to what President Biden proposed. It was $1.9 trillion, as you said. That's on top of $900 billion that was passed in December, which is also spending out this year. So that's a total of $2.8 trillion this year. It is, families have already gotten checks. Most households between the two bills have gotten $2,000 per person. If you're a family of four, that means you're getting $8,000. You saw that in consumer spending in January when the first set of checks went out, and I expect we're going to see it in the data for March when we get that. States and localities are getting a lot of money, so my hope is that they're going to start to rehire a lot of the employees that they laid off over the last year. And I expect as a result of this, by the end of the year or sometime in next year, the US economy will look an awful lot like the pandemic never happened. Now, we can come back to the question of whether we could have done all of this for less money. I think we probably could have, but it's bringing overwhelming force, and I think it's broadly speaking going to work to get the economy back to where you'd want it to be.
I mean, on that note, Jason, unfortunately, there wasn't any bipartisan support for this legislation. The Republicans stood on the sidelines, and although over 70% of Americans are in favor of this package, including some Republican voters, but I don't believe the legislation got any Republican support. Is there any is any of their criticism warranted? You mentioned maybe the price tag was a bit too high. Will it be something that, is it going to be targeted? And how will oversight be managed?
Right. I mean, there's two senses in which you could argue the price tag was too high. One is that it creates more risk of inflation than benefit for the economy. I think there's something to that argument. I'm not that worried about it. Inflation forecasts are relatively muted, but I think that's a reasonable debate to have. The second is the legislation definitely included things unrelated to the pandemic. And so the question is, what do you think about using a crisis as an opportunity to get things done? When the thing you're using it as an opportunity to get done is cut the child poverty rate in half, I confess I don't view that as a problem at all. In fact, I think that's quite a wonderful thing. But I respect that others said, you know what, child poverty, important issue, don't need to do it as part of this legislation. But I'm personally glad that they took advantage of the opportunity they had.
And do you think, other items that the Democrats want to be passed, such as a minimum wage, do you think that's still going to be feasible, considering, like you said, that, it was, nobody really imagined that 1.9 trillion would be passed in March. When you worked in the Obama administration, maybe looking back, maybe you think that maybe we should have asked for more. I don't know, is that the case?
Yeah, I mean, we asked for the maximum I think we could. At the time, Congress was thinking about something like a $300 billion stimulus. We ended up with an $800 billion stimulus. So I think we pushed the envelope a lot. But the issue now is the arcane US legislative procedures, which is that most legislation requires 60 votes to pass the Senate. And they were able to do this legislation under a procedure called reconciliation that lowered that threshold to 50 votes. Reconciliation doesn't work for a minimum wage increase. So they'd have to either negotiate with Republicans to get 60 votes, or end the filibuster and make everything a 50-vote threshold. Even in either of those cases, they would need to somehow get moderates on board who don't want to go to $15 an hour, and keep progressives on board who absolutely want to go to $15 an hour. Minimum wage is one where I actually think a compromise would be good. I think raising it, if a deal raised it to something like $11, $12 an hour, I think that would be pretty reasonable.
And Jason, sticking on to the point about, what comes next after this 1.9 trillion package has been passed, I mean, how much room is there to maneuver about the other sort of plans on the horizon, such as an infrastructure deal? I read a really interesting article in the New Yorker where you were quoted, and I'd like to share that with everybody here right now. You said in the article that I think there is a danger that this is crowding things out politically, but it could also be crowding things in politically. Can you explain that? I mean, is this sort of dangerous looking at it from a political point of view, because there wasn't Republican support, and most likely taxes will have to be raised at some point to offset expenditure?
Yeah, I mean, from an economic perspective, I think we have more room for additional investment. I think some of that investment could be paid for. I don't think all of that investment needs to be paid for. In some respects, our debt is actually too low, as evidenced by the fact that our interest rates are too low, and some additional borrowing, I think, would benefit the economy. So from an economic space, I think we have more, economic perspective, we have more space. There's then a political question. Some people have a mental model, I'm making up numbers. Congress was willing to pass $2.5 trillion this year, unpaid for. They just did $2 trillion. And so now there's not much money left for infrastructure. There's another mental model, which is Congress just passed $2 trillion. A lot of them think infrastructure is even more important than what they just did. So they're going to want to spend even more than $2 trillion on infrastructure. And people have been desensitized to these large numbers by passing them over and over again. I think that second model is just as likely to be true as the first model.
So Jakob, I'd love to bring you in right now. Jason doesn't see any, huge need for concern regarding inflation, overheating of the economy. From your vantage point across the Atlantic, do you think any fears of inflation are justified?
No, I mean, I think I largely share Jason's assessment there. You may get a modest overshoot, but nothing, we're not talking about the 1970s here. And if you look at financial markets, there hasn't been a massive increase in the long-term inflation adjusted rate of interest. We're talking maybe 2.5% on a TIPS 10-year and the like. So no, I largely agree with Jason's assessment. And I also think that in some ways, as Jason said, it's sort of, taking a crisis and doing something good with it, right? It's something that every time there is a crisis in the Eurozone, you sort of tend to construct a new institutional element to European integration. You did this also in Europe this time around with the recovery fund. And it seems interesting from a European point of view that here is, as Jason mentioned, arguably Congress, or certainly the Biden administration, using this crisis to construct something that looks, because of the content of this package, there's a lot of income support, child income support, money for, as Jason mentioned, state and local governments, something that begins to look like a, more, I wouldn't go as far as to say perhaps, European welfare state, but certainly a more comprehensive social safety net, even if it is so far only temporary. And then, of course, the big question becomes which part of these new expenditure items are over time going to be made permanent, and are Democrats going to be as successful at making their initially temporary spending measures permanent as Republicans have been to making many of their initially temporary tax cuts also permanent. So I think that's, but overall, from a European point of view, there should also be a big thank you to the United States, because there's no doubt that this very large fiscal stimulus is going to have a positive economic spillover effect also on the European economy. We can debate how big it is, but in the first half and the third quarter of 2021, I think it would be certainly macroeconomically relevant. You're probably also going to have a stronger dollar vis-a-vis the euro, which is something that many Europeans should also welcome. So quite frankly, with a muted inflation outlook and a very direct positive economic spillover, there's a lot for Europeans to cheer over in this package, in my opinion.
I definitely want to get Jason's reaction to that about the spillover effects with regard to government spending in the United States. But Jakob, let's also talk about Europe. Germany definitely also pulled out a bazooka last year, and Europe did also pass recovery funds. Was it enough? Do you think in terms of size that the governments have spent enough? Granted, there is more of a welfare state here in Europe, but still, was it enough? Or do you think that there is going to be a gulf that will emerge between the United States and Europe?
I think if you look at the data up until the end of 2020, the difference wasn't actually that big, right? The overall increase in the fiscal impulse in the euro area was somewhere between 7 and 8%, and in the US, probably around 10%. So the difference wasn't that big, especially if you factor in that the decline in employment in the euro area or the EU was much less than in the United States. So the employment in the EU is only down less than 2%. Over the course of 2020, that's a lot more in the US. So the question from a European perspective is that going to change going forward? Is there sort of an avalanche of bankruptcies that is going to kick in across the euro area economy when various support schemes and wage subsidy schemes, etc., expire at some point. We don't know that yet. But certainly if you ask European banks and their supervisors, they don't seem to be overly worried about a huge wave of bankruptcies and non-performing loans and the like. So overall, I would say also factoring in that there's going to be more fiscal stimulus coming in the euro area. We've already seen it recently in Germany, in Italy, France, as a direct function of the extended lockdowns. So I would say that overall, I don't think that the fiscal stimulus in the euro area to date was necessarily too small. It's not going to match what Congress has just passed going forward, but it will certainly be adequate to greatly mitigate the effects of the pandemic, which is something that in the euro area was not true after the global financial crisis. So in many ways, Europe has probably moved as much fiscally in a sort of expansionary direction relative to the global financial crisis as we have now seen in the United States.
Thanks, Jakob. I see people posing questions, so I encourage all of you to keep them coming and I'll get to them very quickly, but I want to go back to Jason and hear your thoughts on what Jakob said about, what will be the effects, maybe not immediate, because right now the package looks very obviously US oriented, but how will this fit into the larger picture when it comes to economic growth in the transatlantic area or even beyond?
Yeah, I think the spillovers of this to a place like Europe are unambiguously positive. I think to most emerging markets, it's positive as well. I think for some of them, it creates some complications. And in general, there's an issue that countries often do insufficient fiscal stimulus because part of the benefit goes abroad. Some of the checks people are getting in the United States are helping the European economy because people are spending them on imports rather than spending them on things in the United States. If you had told Americans that this was partly a fiscal stimulus for the rest of the world, that probably would have been a minus, politically, not a plus. But it's not that big a deal because we're a more closed economy. When you go to Europe, that becomes a really big deal. If France does a fiscal stimulus, a lot of the benefits of that are for Belgium and Spain. When Germany does a fiscal stimulus, a lot of the benefits of that are for Italy and Portugal. And that can lead to insufficient fiscal stimulus. Last year, Sudha, as you said, Germany pulled out the bazooka. A lot of countries did a lot. But I think in general, there's a real asymmetry in Europe. You don't take into account as much the positive spillovers of fiscal policy. Fiscal rules can force countries or try to force countries to do fiscal consolidations, but can't force them to do fiscal expansions. There's no penalty for having too large a budget surplus. And so, thinking through how to have more fiscal federalism in Europe, how to have more symmetric rules, how to take into account the positive spillovers of fiscal policy and build them into national policy making, I think is going to be very important going forward.
I think you're muted, Sudha. Sorry
about that. You would think after more than a year of working with Zoom that I would figure out the mute button. I have one more question and then I'm going to go to audience questions. But I mean, for the both of you, do you sense there's sort of a rethinking in general about the role of government and government spending? It's not really, I mean, maybe this is more for Jason in the US. It's not really considered a taboo perhaps as it was maybe a few years ago. And how do you think, will this stay or is this just sort of a temporary phase because of, the economic calamities on both sides of the Atlantic? Jason, why don't we start with you and then I'll go to Jakob.
Yeah, I think there is much less of a concern with budget deficits. A lot of that is justified by the fact that interest rates are so low and remain so low that gives us more space to run deficits and to maintain debt. I think in some cases there's too much comfort with budget deficits and debt. For example, when you talk about forgiving $50,000 of student loan for graduate students, I think that probably gets to a point where there's some finite budget constraint somewhere. We have a lot more fiscal room, but is that how? But it's still finite, and is that how you want to use your finite fiscal room? So I think there's definitely more comfort with that. In terms of spending, probably, but some of the largest items here were things like direct checks. And so that's not exactly standard government spending, but this was, as you noted at the beginning, very popular. What there still isn't is any comfort level at all with higher taxes on the bottom 99% of Americans. And I think until you overcome that discomfort with higher taxes on the bottom 99% of Americans, you're going to have a very hard time having substantially higher spending on a sustained basis. Yes, you can run a little bit of a bigger deficit. Yes, you can raise taxes on the rich. But if you want, Europe, if you want the United States to look a little bit more like Europe in terms of social safety net and social protections, eventually you're going to need to figure out how to raise taxes on more than just the top 1%.
And Jakob, I mean, the philosophy is obviously different here. People feel more comfortable with, bigger government, larger government in their lives. But I mean, I'm sure there are people also wondering here, how are we going to pay for all this?
I think that's true, but I think that there is going to be, in my opinion, a significant, if you like, intellectual spillover as well. The sort of the carefree nature and less emphasis on size of budget deficit in light of lower interest rates from the United States is going to spill over to the European debate, which it should, because I think most people would say, and I certainly believe it, that interest rates in Europe on average are likely to remain considerably lower than in the United States. So from a purely sort of debt burden cost, Europe is going to be able to sustain even higher levels of debt in the long run than perhaps the United States. From that, just in terms of what is the size of the interest burden now, there's growth differentials. The others also play a role, but bottom line is that, no, I think this is happening. It certainly will come to the forefront when the EU is going to have to reform its Stability and Growth Pact. Currently, that is suspended. It is suspended next year as well. They're not going to start talking about a reform of it until after the German elections. But then they're probably going to stop talking about that again until after the French elections. So you're unlikely to see it reformed probably until 2023. And it's going to require a major change, because it's basically designed for how the world looked in the early 1990s, which is very different today, much lower interest rates and obviously much higher debt levels. And that's where this sort of less concern, if you like, in the short run about fiscal deficits, I think absolutely is going to play a significant role. You see it also in the German debate. You look at the party program of the Green Party, which is virtually certain to get into government after the elections in September. That's a very different program than what is espoused in the current debt brake at the federal level. So there's going to be likely fundamental reform of that too. So no, I do certainly believe, and I'm happy to say that I do think Europe will shift in its approach to this also in the medium term.
Fascinating. Okay, so let me get to the first question here from Holger. He's asking, how much would an infrastructure bill benefit politically from being framed as being a compete with China bill? Would that be a feasible option for the Biden administration? I mean, do you think China is going to be a talking point when it comes to the infrastructure bill? Jason, we'll go to you first.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not an expert in messaging, but as far as I can tell, calling anything compete with China makes it more attractive to people. I think the truth is, whether China existed or not, we would want to have more infrastructure. We would want both the jobs it creates in the short run, but especially the benefits it has for the supply side of the economy in the long run. So the arguments for infrastructure are largely domestic ones, but if people want to message it around China and that's attractive to people, that's fine with me.
And Jakob, since we have you here as well, and you're sitting in Europe, and obviously China is a very, very current right now, as is in the United States regarding sanctions. Do you think that, maybe talk a little bit about how not only China and the US, or Europe and the US can align politically on messaging, but also economically? Do you see any movement in that area moving forward with the Biden administration, and now considering, that Europe is also realizing that China may have some economic benefits, but there are other costs associated as well?
No, I think that, there's a lot of quite remarkable things have actually happened just this week. Tonight, or I guess midday in the US, President Biden is addressing the European Council. That's never happened before. And earlier this week, the EU followed a number of other countries, including the United States, directly sanctioning Chinese officials over Xinjiang and human rights. That hasn't happened, at least to my knowledge, since Tiananmen Square, almost 30 years ago. And then there was obviously a very strong Chinese response to that. So certainly, relative to China, I believe that the prospects for, first of all, the passage of the new investment treaty between the EU and China is probably on standby for the foreseeable future, since the European Parliament has to approve it, and several members of that parliament was directly sanctioned by the Chinese government. But the prospects for a deeper European and US transatlantic cooperation on this set of issues, which of course is not just economics, not just political, it's technology, it's a whole host of other things, are absolutely, this week has been a very good week for that, in my opinion. And perhaps just one thing on how you message the spending bill in the US. Biden is clearly also, messaging the infrastructure bill as a green bill, right? There's going to be a lot of climate change in that, just like anything you want to, which is the same in Europe. The recovery fund is 40% earmarked or so, climate change related investment. So this is clearly, perhaps, certainly in Europe, climate is a better messenger than China when it comes to fiscal expenditure. And I would say that probably is also true in the United States.
Do you think that's true, Jason, that climate investment will also, you think the American people will see the need for that in the infrastructure package that's online next?
Yes, I think they'll see the need for climate investments. Whether they will see the need for higher prices for electricity produced by coal, which ultimately you need to have if you're going to switch people away from coal-based electricity, is a little bit of a heavier lift. And that goes back to what we said before, maybe more comfort with government spending, still very, very high levels of discomfort with anything resembling taxation. And you need both of those instruments to solve a lot of the problems and challenges that we have.
Okay, and the next question is from Benjamin. He is asking, will the US stimulus have a positive or negative effect on the outlook for trade negotiations between the United States and Europe? Trade is not really a popular word these days in the US, but this question is to both of you. What are the prospects for further free trade agreements between the US and Europe? I guess there's still, tariffs that need to be talked about, but are there any prospects, you think, within the next 4 years, Jakob and Jason?
Well, I can start. I think, I don't think the Biden administration is going to enter into any major trade negotiation with anybody before, at least before the midterms, probably not even in the first term. But on the other hand, so I mean, this sort of idea that TTIP is coming back or something like that, that's going to be wildly, off the mark. But at the same time, I do think that some of the measures that we have seen, we've already talked about how on China-related issues, I actually think that this week may very well have been a watershed. A lot of things happened on that front. But over the last couple of weeks, you have seen the administration indicate that it is interested in a deal at the OECD on global corporate tax reform, the BEPS procedure, digital taxation, etc., which is something that's very high on the European agenda. You have also moved recently to suspending sanctions in the Boeing Airbus dispute, which is, of course, another oldie trade dispute that we've had lingering for over 20 years. So I think that, we're going to be having quite a lot of, if you like, it's not just low-hanging fruit, but it's actually tangible progress on specific issues in the coming months. And again, I don't think Biden would be addressing the European Council later today if there wasn't material prospects for those kinds of policy deliverables.
Jason, what do you think? You worked in the Obama administration when TTIP was part of the agenda. What are the prospects for closer economic cooperation? I won't say free trade, but closer economic cooperation between U.S. and Europe?
I agree with Jakob's answer completely. I like TTIP. I think it would be a good thing to do. I don't think it's going to be high up on the agenda. It doesn't make me that sad that it's not high up on the agenda. There's already enormous amounts of effectively free trade between the United States and Europe. Reducing the remaining barriers has a very high level of controversy relative to economic benefit. It still has an economic benefit, so I'd like to do it at some point. But in the meantime, focusing on more important issues and taxes, in part topic I've worked on, is I think a really a great potential area. And in terms of how the American Rescue Plan plays into this, which was part of the question, I think, insofar as the US economy is in a strong, good place, that'll make people feel more comfortable looking internationally and engaging internationally, and have a little bit more of an open-minded, positive-sum attitude towards that. So I think the economic recovery in the United States will help all sorts of cooperation. I just think channeling it in the direction of things like taxes and then issues outside the economic sphere is probably more important than TTIP itself, as much as TTIP would be perfectly wonderful to do.
So, I mean, we gathered both of you here to discuss economic recovery in light of the pandemic, but right now there is, some economic nationalism going on as well when it comes to vaccines. The U.S. not exporting vaccines that are sitting, there, and also now, von der Leyen in Brussels also talking about export bans. Do you think, in light of, Jakob, you mentioned Biden speaking today virtually to European leaders in Brussels, do you see eventually more cooperation on that front?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's absolutely coming.
And this is a question from an audience member, just to
I think that's absolutely coming. I don't think the Biden administration is going to allow large-scale vaccine exports until they have reached its own goal of having, quote unquote, enough vaccines to vaccinate all Americans, which are currently scheduled, I think, to be in early mid-May. So that's still about maybe 6 weeks away from here. But after that, absolutely, the United States is going to become a very rapidly scaling up and very large vaccine exporter, if for no other reason to counter China strategically around the world. So absolutely, the Biden administration will want to do that. And I think also, and the same, by the way, is going to be true for even the EU. It's going to take a little longer. The EU is probably not going to become a net vaccine, a large-scale net, or beyond what it already does, but sort of all out until August or September. But at that point, the EU is going to become a very large vaccine exporter as well. So that we are going to end up in a situation where globally, it's my firm belief that the vast majority of global citizens are going to be vaccinated using vaccines that are produced either in the Europe or the United States. It's the sort of vaccine diplomacy that you have seen conducted by China and Russia is, in my opinion, a very temporary affair, and of course facilitated by the fact that these two dictatorships don't really care very much about vaccinating their own population first.
Jason, would you like to weigh in on that? Do you see vaccine diplomacy being used as a soft power tool in the future as well?
Absolutely. I mean, we're going to have way, way more vaccines than we need in the United States. We're going to have that very soon, and a lot of the world will benefit from that. And yes, everyone's very anxious, completely understandably, about getting it this month versus next month. But, I think we're going to get there soon enough.
Okay, we just have a few minutes left. I'd like to have both of you also kind of offer your perspectives on the other side of the Atlantic. Jason, when you look at what Europe is doing, is there anything that the United States could learn from, social safety net spending that the Europeans do, like the Kurzarbeit in Germany, where, money was given directly to the employers is one example. And Jakob, same goes for you. Is there something that Europe can also look to as a model when it comes to government spending in the future for creating economic strength?
So I think that's a great question. And I think we really do need to be looking to see what lessons we can learn. I think some things are too soon to tell. In the United States, we gave money to people, and it wasn't attached to a particular job through the unemployment insurance system. In Europe, you gave money to employers, and it was attached to a job. Right now, if I had to bet, I would bet on the US system as more flexible, let you rebound more quickly. And I think we'll have a less of an increase in the unemployment rate when all of this is over than Europe has, but I'm not sure. I'd love to see a careful analysis of that. Another one is small business lending. My impression is that a number of European countries had more successful efforts at that. In the United States, we basically did two things. We had the PPP program, which gave out 600, maybe even more $billion. It wasn't even a lending program, it was a grant program. And then we had lending programs where the criteria were drawn so tightly that they ended up barely lending anything, the Main Street lending program from the Federal Reserve. So surely there was something in between where you don't just hand out $600 billion to small businesses, but you don't make your lending terms so onerous that no one shows up for them. And my sense is that there are more in-betweens that were done more successfully in Europe. But I think a lot of this is too soon to tell, but a question that we need to be asking and looking at carefully.
And Jakob, what do you think?
No, I mean, I think, there's a number of lessons that I certainly believe that the idea of paying people directly rather than employers is probably also something that in some European labor markets might probably work better, especially in those who need higher levels of sectoral reallocation anyway. Than others. So this notion that it's great for the overall European economy that essentially every member of the EU and Euro member have adopted the paying employer model as opposed to paying people model that Jason described. I don't necessarily think that is going to be optimal. I think there would probably be some countries that would have been benefited from the sort of more flexible approach that Jason outlined for the United States. I certainly think that the vaccine situation is a classical example of the U.S. federal government deploying massive financial and fiscal firepower and risk capital at an early stage where comparable European spending was not present in the spring and early summer of last year. And this is really, to a large extent, the reason why it's not the only reason, but it certainly explains to a large extent why it is that the United States have many more vaccines available right now. the federal government was willing to put risk capital on the table in April, May, June last year. Europe was not to nearly the same extent, and it came later. By and large, European member states only invested in vaccines after the phase 2 trials became known in August last year, and that's why we're in the situation that we're in now in Europe. So the willingness to deploy, if you like, overwhelming fiscal and financial force is absolutely again, I might say, a lesson that European leaders, and I think there was an interesting interview given by French President Macron yesterday, which highlighted this fact that he basically said, look, in Europe we didn't shoot for the moon when it came to vaccines. In the US they did. And obviously, I think that's one of the things that European leaders going forward should absolutely learn from. So when we think about how the next pandemic will be addressed in the European Union, it absolutely needs to talk budget as well. You need a much bigger centralized budget up front to have the successes you would like to have.
Okay, so I'm going to combine the last two questions in a lightning round, and you both can be very brief because there is a doubter still in the audience about inflation. So maybe you can sum up in a sentence why these concerns are not justified, because both of you seem to think that the spending is necessary right now. So let's start with that one. And then the second question relates to why Europe and the United States should come first. We have the pandemic being sort of a black swan event, although many pundits talked about this happening. And now it's here, but there will be other events. How can Europe and the United States work together to, insulate against future economic downturns? So, Jason, why don't you start, and then,
In the interest of time, why don't I answer the first one, and Jakob probably maybe just wants to do the second one.
Sounds good.
There is a risk of inflation. There's a lot of uncertainty right now. We've never run the experiment we're running of a pandemic coming to an end at the same time there's a large-scale fiscal stimulus. I think on balance, the forecasts are for reasonable amounts of inflation. Even if there's a temporary elevation in inflation that it's not sustained, I think the Fed will do more if it needs to. But on balance, I think the thing that I'm most confident in is that the economy is going to be in quite good shape by the end of next year, by the end of this year, beginning of next year, unless some terrible thing happens with the variants escaping from the vaccines.
Jakob, U.S.-Europe cooperation.
Yeah, no, I think actually this week was a good example of why it's a good thing and why we're going to see a lot more of it. Namely that, the sort of formative geopolitical rivalry right now is yes, the US has more direct sort of national security interest in Asia, in and around China's territory, which Europe probably doesn't. But certainly both Europe and the United States have a very strong interest in the systemic, if you like, rivalry when it comes to democracy versus authoritarianism. We saw that again highlighted this week with human rights-based sanctions from both countries vis-a-vis China. But I think we should also be clear that what happens in that race or in that sort of rivalry and what happens with the Chinese economy is really down to a function of Chinese domestic economic policy that there isn't that much we can do about directly. But I think we shouldn't underestimate, in my opinion, the enormous structural challenges that the Chinese government faces with the unfolding of a dramatic demographic transition, declining population, very, very high debt levels, and also an economic philosophy under President Xi that basically says less market, less private sector, and more government. That doesn't, to me, sound like China is going to be maintaining the kind of growth rates that we have seen over the last 30 to 40 years. So, maybe this sort of idea that the US-China or China-Western rivalry is going to be the defining feature for the next many decades might not turn out that way.
Well, that was a good note to end on, and just based on both of your answers, we'll have to come back to evaluate, as Jason said, whether things worked. Big thank you to you, Jason, at Cambridge, and a big thank you to you, Jakob, and Brussels, and thanks to everybody that's tuned in today. I hope you'll join us next time for one of our GMF conversations. In the meantime, enjoy the rest of your afternoon and your morning. Thank you very much. Bye.
Bye all.
Bye-bye.